Our guest today on the Strong Women podcast is my friend Catherine Wheeler. Now, Catherine grew up in a Christian home. In fact, her dad was a pastor. But when she went off to college, she walked away from her faith for quite a long time. And so part of her story is that she became an OBGYN doctor. And throughout that, she even ended up performing some abortions. And through some twists and turns and hard situations and hard times, Christ got a hold of Catherine. And her story is so powerful. We wanted to share this story with you of how God got a hold of Catherine and brought her out of darkness and into an intimate and deep friendship with him. And so thank you so much, Catherine, for coming on with us today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I have just absolutely loved this podcast and learned so much from all these amazing women. So, yeah, I'm excited.
Well, okay, Catherine, we want to share your story. So if you sound like you've listened to some of the podcasts before, so you know we always like to start where all the women started. So tell us about your growing up. Where did you grow up, and what kind of family did you grow up in?
I grew up in Rhode Island. My dad was a minister. My mom stayed home with us kids. I was the ninth of 11 kids. There was after me a 7 and a 9 year gap. So I don't actually remember all my siblings being at home. So I grew up the whole time in Rhode Island.
Okay. So you were a pastor's kid. Okay, yeah.
And I've learned there's different kinds of pastors' kids, but my dad was a very faithful follower of Jesus, a very humble man. As he said, when I asked what it was like to have 11 kids, he said I was faithful. And given this, at first I was a little taken back. I'm like, oh, just tell me how much you love me. And I was like, actually, that's probably in this world one of the best responses he could have given. He was faithful. My mom, like I used to before I understood about Jesus, I thought she got up and prayed for an hour to get through the day. But looking at my mom, as my brother said at her funeral, he wrote a poem that said my mom was the face of God. And she was. When my life fell apart, it was the memory of my mom and seeing how she walked out her faith that told me I could call out to God.
So how was that growing up as a pastor's kid? Like you said, that can look quite differently depending on who's answering the question. But so what was your experience as the daughter of a pastor?
It was very simple. We grew up in a very small town. Our life was simple. It was clearly all about God. I think ministers these days handle it a little bit differently. I was born in 59, so it was mostly the 60s and early 70s. And then we were considered an extension of our father's ministry, which was hard and not always good. When I came to faith in my 50s, I recognized that my minister handled his family very differently, where they were very separate from his ministry. But my experience growing up was of being in a family where we were loved. They loved God. It was all about ministry to God. I think I missed the personal relationship part of it. You never know what seeds, as I look back, because my siblings all tell different stories. So I think the seeds that I picked up that the evil one used were seeds of perfectionism, kind of external behavior, being an example, things like that I missed the personal relationship.
Where it felt like more of just a show?
It didn't feel like a show because my parents lived it out. There was no hypocrisy in my family, but it was more like we were an example to the community as opposed to, just living our lives as kids, So it was more like that feeling of we're an example. And the same thing happens in being a doctor. They call it walting. You always walk, act, and look and talk like a doctor. And so there's always this front, like you're never really known. You're not vulnerable or yourself. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then you said you didn't come to faith till you were 50. So what did that look like transitioning out of your parents' house, and where did you go from there, from like graduation kind of thing?
Yeah, so I remember in my teens feeling a call to give my life to Jesus, and I remember getting baptized. And I remember having a period where I was reading the Word a lot, but I don't remember praying or relationship. But I feel like at that point I was in God's hand and he never let go as I look back at it. But when I went to college, I would still go. We had moved to Denver at that point, and then I went to Colorado State. And so my first year, I would go home on weekends and be part of the church community. It wasn't a healthy church. And in my second year of college, I met my boyfriend, which reminds me of Tim Keller saying when kids come back from their first year of college and say, I don't believe anymore, he says, who are you sleeping with? But I met my boyfriend, and I remember being brought up where it was taboo to have sex before marriage. And I remember calling somebody I was close to and saying, what do you think about this? Well, she was already on that path. And she's like, oh, it's no big deal. You go to Planned Parenthood and get on pills. And so I became involved with my boyfriend and ended up moving in with him. And it took me a little while to tell my parents that's what I'd done. And my father actually drove up unannounced from Denver and tried to convince me to go a different way, and then told me I wasn't allowed to come home anymore. And but then interestingly, and I'm sorry if I tear up at this, but he came back after a few minutes and knocked and said, I can't say goodbye to my daughter without telling you I love you. So, like, there was that mixed up. I was pig-headed enough to say, well, that's fine if I'm not allowed to come home. He was very worried about his ministry, although when he came back, I knew he loved me. But I wouldn't back away from that. And it just started a downward spiral in my life. So I at that point, obviously, had stepped away from a very good path. You know what I mean? And so there were 2.5, maybe 3.5 years where I had, my mother wrote me letters every month, but other than that, I had no communication with my family, which to me made me, family's very important to me, you know, that time away. But the interesting thing is God kept, like, I would start down a path and God would stop it. Like, I would experiment with things and I'd be like, oh, that's horrible. Why did people try this stuff? So it was obvious to me that God kept pulling me in so I didn't go too far down paths. And I was actually pretty aware of that, which is now as a believer, I'm like, just the hand of God through the time and his goodness in all that time where we're prodigals just going, yeah, that's good enough. I'm going to do things my way. I mean, it's just astounding for me to look back at all the ways he kept me.
Yeah, and I think too that's so often how we see God's hand is in hindsight when we get through something or, you know, go through something. It's oftentimes when we look back on our lives or reflect on some years that we really do see how God's hand was with us or how he was pursuing us in different ways.
Can I say one more thing about that? You know, there were times, like early on in this time, God wanted me to know for sure that he's God. And there were 3 things that really stand out that made it so clear to me. Like, I would tell people, I know there's a God. But one of them was when I'd started a PhD, and I was actually going to marry this boyfriend who'd gone down to Louisiana. We'd gone different directions for graduate school. And I ended up going down there thinking that we were going to get married. And then I decided, instead of going back to my PhD, that I was going to go to med school instead. And so there was 2 classes I had to take that summer in order to do my MCATs and apply to school. And one of them was a physiology class. And we learned about anaphylaxis with fire ants. And, you know, that was interesting. But 2 weeks later, I got stung for the second time by a fire ant and went into anaphylaxis. And if I had not taken that class 2 weeks before, I would have just literally gone in and laid on a couch and died. So, you know, I was so close to death when I got to the hospital. I mean, it's just astounding. But I knew then, like, God had gone ahead of me and made sure I had that information. And then in med school, I'd gotten married to somebody else and had had my first child. My parents actually, in all their grace, came down to where I was in med school and cared for me and my children. I was still married, but that wasn't good. And so my first son was 10 months old, and we had a child CPR class. And in that class, I was very quiet and didn't ask a lot of questions. There was such a pressure in me to keep asking questions about this child CPR. And they're talking about, you do back thrust. And I said, but what if that doesn't work? And they said, well, then, you try abdominal thrust. You keep going back and forth. If it's not working, you keep going back and forth. And again, within 2 weeks, I get home early from med school. Right then, my son choked on an orange. He's turning blue. I'm telling Mom, do something. And she's going, you're doing everything you can. And because I'd had that, I was doing everything that person had told me to do. And after maybe 4 or 5 minutes, that orange came flying out of his mouth across the room. And he's like, why are you beating me? But so there were a few things. There was one other thing that happened that was just clearly God had gone ahead. And so I always knew there's a God. That was never a doubt to me.
So even then you could say, whoa, God really saved me there.
Yeah, and it was like, I know God has something for me. Like, I knew there was some kind of purpose for me to be on earth. I can remember kind of conversing with myself, like, if I followed God, I'd have to give everything up. Like, I didn't understand, as Jackie Hill Perry says, the beauty of Jesus. Like, if I'd understood the beauty of Jesus and how much better this is, but I didn't understand that part. I thought, well, you have to give everything up if you're a Christian,
So fire ants, I just have to go back to this because I'm a Southern girl. Fire ants are for real in the South. They're not here in Colorado, so you must have been in Louisiana.
So, yes, I'm sorry. I was in New Orleans.
Okay, you were in New Orleans.
Actually, I was in Baton Rouge when that happened, yeah.
And I'm from California, so I don't know what you guys are talking about.
Yeah. I hope you never get stung by one.
Oh, it's terrible.
Yeah.
Okay, so you decided to go to medical school. So how did that come about? Even that desire to switch and do something different.
Yeah, so my first degree was in human nutrition, and that's where I was getting a PhD in. You do research on rats, and I've got kind of a soft heart to animals. Sometimes you don't know, but I just didn't think things through a lot when I was younger. And so when I got there and you're doing all that research on rats, I'm like, I don't know if I want to do this for a life, So as I thought about, when I ended up not marrying my first boyfriend, I was like, okay, what am I going to do? And I was thinking about law or medicine and chose medicine. So, and it was a really good fit for me.
But okay, not just medicine, an OBGYN, like for, what led you there?
Do you know, it was the last thing I wanted to do because people assumed, that was part of my growing up is women can, women can't. I just felt like being a woman was in a box. I hated being a female when I was young. And, people say, oh, you're going to go to med school, so you're going to be a pediatrician or OB-GYN. I'm like, absolutely not. I'm going to be a surgeon. I'm going to be a hand surgeon. That's what I'm going to do, my little sassy attitude. So I got married in med school. I had my first and second child in med school. My first child was born the beginning of my third year, which is your clinicals. And so I had to take off a period of time, which was amazing. Like I didn't think I'd ever get married or ever have kids. And the beautiful surprise when I became pregnant, 'cause all I heard was, like my mom, what I heard is she could have been a doctor, but she decided to marry a minister and have kids. So to me, it was all negative. And so when I was married and then went off birth control, don't even ask me. And of course, you're immediate, because I went home on weekends. He lived in Baton Rouge. And of course, I'm pregnant, And at first, I was like, oh my gosh, life's over. And it was literally no time where I was so in love with that baby and couldn't wait. And I couldn't believe, I thought it was always an awful experience. It was a beautiful experience. And when I had him, I'm like, I just want to be home with him. I couldn't believe that was not me. That's motherhood,
I'm curious about when did that negative about being a female and about having kids, where was that kind of nurtured? I mean, you mentioned, was it your mom you said that had that?
Yeah, I wish that I'd heard how much she loved children and how much that was a joy to her. Again, you don't know, like looking back, some of my siblings heard a slightly different story. So I have a feeling that there were seeds of, what I picked up on was that she could have been something, but she was a mother, and isn't that a shame? As opposed to, after she passed, I was reading some things and I was like, oh my gosh, she actually loved being a mom. Like, it was such a joy. I didn't pick up on that. By the time you've got a ninth child, you're exhausted, and she's a minister's wife.
You're just tired.
And she's tired, so I didn't pick
and
up
if
on
it's
that.
if it's that kind of atmosphere where the minister's family is always on display, like you kind of alluded to earlier, that's
Right.
exhausting. And not only do you have to keep yourself all together, you got to keep your kids all together. And we know we're mothers. You can't keep your kids together. Like, they're going to do what you can't control behavior all the time.
That's right. Yeah. And, it was the 60s, and it was becoming, people were becoming more aware of women didn't always have choice. And I think, I've lived in some pretty conservative places, like Utah and Mesa, Arizona, and, other places where women don't have voice, and that's what I grew up with, is women don't have voice. Men make all decisions. It's all about the men. There wasn't that servanthood of men. What's one of the healings God has brought for me is to actually see couples where, one couple in specific, Janine and Dave, if you're listening, just to actually see a godly marriage where he is like Jesus to her and wants her to be everything she can be. It was mind-blowing for me. I had never seen that. All I'd seen is women serve men, and that's all we exist for. And I wanted nothing of that, I just,
Well, I was just going to say, so you must, this is the 60s, and you come out of that kind of, atmosphere where women, like you just described, that women were serving men, and you didn't see that vice versa happening. So, and then you said you didn't really want to become a wife or a mom. Do you feel like you were really influenced by the feminist movement of that time, that era?
Absolutely. And I think it was a lie, the lie that you can have everything, that you can have a full career and be a mom and be the provider. You can't. It's a lie. You have to make choices along the way. And the lie that I heard was women can be successful. The most important thing is for you to be everything that you can be. Yeah. And so I was surprised when I had my son, it's like all I wanted to do was be home with my kids. Like, that was, then how do you do that? You've already got all this debt in med school. You're on a path.
And you're 3 years in, like you're 3 years in, so.
Right. Which, I'm not saying I didn't love my career. It was such a fit for me. And if I'd known God, it would have worked very differently.
Okay, so this was a marriage, it sounds like it wasn't healthy.
It was an abusive marriage. It was, one thing I'd say to the young women, you get into these relationships, and when you sleep with somebody, you're attached. And as Katie Faust said, you then are making decisions by sliding into them instead of making a conscious decision. And I think, I had some abandonment issues. Like, if somebody liked me, that's good enough. You know what I mean? As opposed to really, like God, after my second divorce, taught me this, I call it the match, no match game, which is wise. It's like, what am I looking for in a husband? I never thought about that. Like, what makes a good relationship? What is that supposed to look like? What do I have? What do they have? Is this really somebody I want to be with? As opposed to, he likes me, and, So there is something huge to dating and actually thinking those things through wisely.
Yeah. So that marriage ended, and then you got married again. And was that also an unhealthy? It sounds like that ended in divorce as well.
It did. We were married 21 years. I would say we both It was a long time. It was evident to me early. It was another situation like the first one. You know, you're with somebody, you have a sexual relationship with somebody, and then you slide into the next step. He's basically a good person. He's was a litigation attorney, and we had 2 more children together. So we had 2 daughters, and he adopted my boys. So we had 4 kids, but it just wasn't good for me from the beginning. He was surprised I ever said that, but I had never learned. I was a people pleaser and an enabler. Didn't have any boundaries. Was the breadwinner. Just wanted to be home with the kids. Success looked like the big house, the nice cars. I just wanted out. I love my patients, but I wanted out of that. And we started counseling early on. I actually asked for a divorce 6 years in, and a friend called and said, "You don't do this. It's hard. You can't do this to your children." And after listening to Katie Faust, I see the incredible evidence. I have thanked that friend, Mary Ann, for that, because she was absolutely right. And so I made a commitment to never ask for a divorce. And so we started counseling, and we basically spent most of the rest of our marriage in counseling. And our last counselor, the last year that we were married, had a very different approach to things. But he finally, about 6 months in, said, "I have nothing else to offer you. Have you considered spirituality?" And I said, "Oh, I don't," and I'm not sure, but I think he was a Buddhist priest. I'm not completely sure, but I'm not sure he's a Christian. But then, amazingly, he said, "There's a book I want you to read. It's called The Prodigal Son by, it's John MacArthur." So I was like, okay, I'll do anything. And, by this point, I had been trying to fix my life forever. Like, God had given me a quest for peace. And so I was doing meditation, yoga, counseling, like self-help books. My friends always laughed. I always had a self-help book. Like, I can make this better. I can just try harder. I can do this, And then I started long distance running, and it was all about, like, people would say, "Why do you do that? It's nuts." And I said, "Well, because at 9 miles, your mind shuts off." Like, that was the only peace I could find. But it was peace that let you keep going in a hard lifestyle. But anyway, so I get that book, and I read it, and I was like, that's interesting. And that might have been around February, March. And then a friend invited us to Easter service. And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I've done church before. Sure, I'll do that." And so we both stood up and accepted Christ. But there was no discipleship afterwards. And so, we just kind of went along horribly. Within a month, I'd yelled at him, he needed to get out of the house. He got out of the house. We separated for a while, moved back in. It was my 3rd child's last year before she went to college. I took her to college, came back. He and I had a horrible asthma attack. He finally came to find me, and we got into a fight, and he's like, "I'm going." And yeah, there it was. It just went downhill from there. But I found myself on a porch one night when I realized that he really was out, and tears. But I just remember just thinking, this is the end of my life. I have given everything for this marriage. There's nothing left. A lot of my thoughts were about dying at that point anyway. And I'm just like, I think I'm going to die from this. There's no way I can keep going. And all I could say was, I don't know what to do. I want my mom, and God help me. God answered that. Like, you hear about a sinner's prayer. That was my sinner's prayer. And a friend, Peggy, came over. My daughter was at dance when she came home, and that's all I'm doing is repeating that, crying on this porch. She called my friend Peggy, who came over, and Peggy's a Christian, and just this peace. And like, in that moment, like, you wouldn't have known, there was a complete change. And so I got up the next morning with a boldness I didn't know, but there was actually peace as opposed to all this self-loathing, horrible, I'm just going to die. Like, there was a peace and a strength and a getting up that happened. And it was different. God just started putting everything for discipleship in place. It was unbelievable looking back at.
Wow, that's so powerful. What did your kids think about what was going on with you? Because it's probably pretty radical, right?
Oh,
radical
my gosh.
Difference.
Yeah. they still struggle a little. I mean, some of them, two of them still struggle with, what does that mean that mom's a Christian? Like, they were watching, but I mean, my life is day and night difference. Rosario Butterfield talks about it's a train wreck when you come to Jesus. Like, God just started taking away everything. And, none of that stuff belongs in his kingdom, right? But, yeah, it was a train wreck, and there was peace in the middle of it, which was just unfathomable. It was honestly, looking back as getting ready for this, just seeing the hand of God in everything. It was amazing. It was like I took my first breath and the light came on in that moment.
So when this happened, your husband had left and you were going
left
through
yet.
Okay.
He had made a decision to leave.
Okay.
So at that point, a friend told me that there was a mentorship program that was starting at her church, the same church I went to where we accepted Christ. And it was Celebrate Recovery. And then it looked like my dad had had a heart attack. And so I went to the East Coast to be with him. And I had a meeting on the East Coast a week later. So I stayed at the hospital with them. And at the hotel, there was a Gideon Bible. And so I would come back to my hotel room at night, and I found this Gideon Bible, and I had not been reading the Bible, and it was the Psalms that I kept open. I would just open, and it would be Psalms. And I would call a friend, Dawn, back in Utah, and she would pray with me every night on the phone in that week. And then when I got back, that Celebrate Recovery group had started. And it was, they did it a little bit differently. You were in a confidential small group for 6 months. And you go through the 12 steps, and our leader was a counselor. She was a trained counselor. And so I learned about, I need God. I already knew that, like everything. I was the house on sand, But Christian fellowship, friendship, being authentic and real about what's going on, like not hiding it, but actually being real and having people care about you in a Christian way. I learned about prayer. I remember, like, God started putting crises in my life, like, how do you even know it's true, right? And so learning about the Bible as the source of truth, and just being shocked, like reading it, thinking I'd thought, my thoughts about the Bible were it's interesting stories and some good advice, but to actually read and go, oh my gosh, this makes sense of my life. No wonder it fell apart, It was incredible.
I want to rewind a little bit and go a little bit more into your career as an OBGYN. And I know that you've shared with me that you performed a few abortions as an OBGYN. And there's one story that you shared that I thought was so powerful, how God got your attention for he kind of unveiled a little bit of the darkness going on in that. Can you share that? Or
Yeah, absolutely. So I was in Utah for residency, and then I stayed and did my entire career in Salt Lake City. And as a resident, of course, it was largely Mormon, especially in the 80s when I lived there. And so a lot of the residents wouldn't do abortions. The University of Utah did abortions only, as I recall, about 16 weeks or less, and only for significant genetic defects, like trisomies or really severe lethal type fetal anomalies. And so you didn't do the rotation all the time, but if you were on the rotation where those were done, the majority of the LDS doctors wouldn't do them. And I'm thinking I'm pro-woman and, just had a compassion for them. And so you think you're doing the right thing. This is not an excuse. I'm telling you the erroneous way of thinking of the world. And so I would offer, if I was on service, I'd offer to be the one to do those, thinking I was helping people. And unfortunately, there weren't that many, but one's too many. And then in private practice, I remember doing one and learning that the anesthesiologist was very upset. And he's like, I have a choice in whether I'm involved in this. And so he stepped out and another anesthesiologist stepped in. And I was like, so there's anesthesiologists who don't agree. Well, it's that LDS thing. So I think at that point I didn't do any more because there was that conflict. But then I had a 16-year-old patient come in with her mom one day, and she wanted to be a doctor, and like, she's pregnant, this is going to ruin her life. And so I went to refer her to the abortion center, and her mom said, that'll be too traumatic, and she knows you, won't you do it? And, I always thought that I would never do that, but to me, I was being compassionate to her, although that's erroneous. But I got into that abortion when she was probably about 6 weeks along and had just started. And it's an impossible thing really to describe, but it was just like this incredible dark heaviness. It was like the whole room was dark and this incredible oppressive heaviness. And it just felt like evil. And all I knew is I had to finish because I'd started and I had to get out of there. So I finished, and I'm like, I'm never doing another one of those. I don't know what that was, but I'm never going to do another one. And I just pushed the memory away, but I never did another one. So, and that was, thankfully early in my career.
And I think it's interesting because through this year of the Colson Fellows program, we've talked a lot about one of the things that the Colson Fellows have to do at the end is come up with a 3-year plan, which sounds intimidating, but it's basically like, what's the next step? What are you going to do with all the things you've learned? And basically, how are you going to act more intentionally in the spheres of influence God has placed you in? And Catherine has said, I really am not looking to be in the pro-life sphere of influence, but God just keeps pulling me back here. So can you tell us a little bit about the things he's pulling you into right now?
Yeah. I moved here 2 summers ago, and I hadn't realized, like, you're a little bit sheltered in Utah, that abortions aren't done after 20 weeks. I had no idea abortions were done until term. So I just thought, that's my past. I'm not doing it anymore. And I kind of tucked it away. But when I saw at Proposition 115 that babies can essentially be aborted until the due date for whatever, and the majority of them are for just whatever, it was just astounding to me. You've got 22-week babies who can be saved. So I just knew, God just kept putting that in front of me along with a lot of other stuff. And I'm like, I can't be silent. He gave me Proverbs 31, being a voice for the voiceless. I'm like, you're right. And so I started getting involved at that point.
Well, I hope you do stay in the fight, Catherine, because I appreciate your perspective, which is quite unique to be coming from the doctor's perspective, and looking at abortion. And I actually really appreciate too that you, just how you're talking about how you didn't really think about, what was going on and really the moral ramifications, because that often can be lost in sometimes when a lot of us are in the pro-life movement and we advocate against abortion, but we can't lose sight that a lot of the doctors and certainly a lot of the women and men who make these decisions often don't have the knowledge and haven't thought through the ramifications. And it sounds like that's where you were at. You just really, it was another procedure in your mind.
Exactly. And, the way that God's changed my mind, like I found that has confronted all these things that I used to think. And the way he's confronted my thoughts about abortion have been so gentle but persistent. But I remember being on a walk with a friend and talking about somebody's experience who was asked if they wanted to see an abortion. Most people have no idea what happens in an abortion. And it was devastating. This woman was devastated. And we were talking about how in the world did we ever do that? Like, you didn't even think about the other side of it. It was, and thinking it through, it's like, well, as a doctor, you do some really hard things and you learn to shut you just have to shut your brain off. People are hurting. You just have to do stuff. And it was like, but how did I miss that was a baby? Like, I just thought, this woman is making a hard choice. Who am I to say? And, a lot of them come out of like unsupportive male partners or husbands, the majority of the time male partners, or a family member like this mom coming in with her daughter, and you just got such compassion, but you don't think about that baby. And that's actually a real baby. And I think, one of the ways God worked through that with me is I'd had 2 miscarriages and had just never grieved them. And I remember as a new Christian, like, you're doing all the things that you need to ask people forgiveness for, and thinking about all the wounds that you've never grieved. And I was grieving with God about my lost babies, And I just heard from God, you're going to see them again. I was like, oh, that's going to be so amazing. And he said, you're going to see the babies you aborted too. And I'm just like, oh my gosh. He said, and they love you. And like, what incredible grace. And then I start thinking about, these little babies that these mothers, and so many women later figure it out. Like the number of times I sat with women who are now pregnant and deciding to keep a baby with an abortion history, and them just saying, how can I keep this one and not that one? It's just overwhelming. When they say there's no regret from abortion, they're asking the wrong questions, because as an OB-GYN, there was regret. These were women who suffered, their relationships suffered, they thought very poorly of themselves. Like, we know in our hearts what we're doing. So, God's grace there to move it through.
Mm-hmm. Have you found that when you share your story, a lot of women come to you seeking that kind of peace that you've found?
I haven't shared my story until last fall as part of Prop 115. That's one of the things God asked me to do, was to share my story. But honestly, there's almost nobody out there who isn't touched by an abortion, whether it's a friend or a family member, or encouraging them to do it, or voting against abortion restriction. I mean, there's almost nobody who isn't affected in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, and what you're talking about too, I think, is why the pro-life movement is so multifaceted, and should be, because like the work that Life Training Institute, we've had Megan Allman and Janique Stewart on, and they're working to talk and teach young people about what abortion really is, and Save the Storks, and they go and give ultrasounds to women who are pregnant to help just to make them aware, because there has been so much deception targeted at women, and fear, and there's all kinds of layers to it, right? But I could just see God using you in big ways, Catherine, to in such a, you're such a gracious, humble woman that can really just come along so many of us who have, made mistakes in all different ways, but are seeking repentance and just an understanding that, you just didn't really think about all that you were doing at that time.
Yeah, and I think, one of the surprises for me was, like, you hear about pregnancy resource centers, and like for me, what I heard is that they were oppressive, and they just didn't give people all the options, and they tried to force people to keep their babies, and they didn't help them in any way. And when I was in Spokane before coming here, I got to be involved in something called Path of Life, and Sherry Olson. And it was just one of those things where God just kept putting it in front of my face. I'm like, oh, I wonder what that is. And I call her and meet with her. I'm like, it's a pregnancy resource center. She says, oh, you should definitely come. And I'm sharing my story, and I get through, but I only did abortions for babies that had anomalies, except for this one time. And I told her about that experience. And she just so lovingly said, I have a daughter with Down syndrome. I just went, oh, okay, corrected. Like, it was my first awareness, like, it's not okay to abort babies that have something that's different about them. And she said, yeah, they encouraged me to abort that baby too. But the grace and the love with which she said that, and she's become a very dear friend. And so I get to meet her daughter, and she's now, when I met her, about 18, incredibly gregarious, funny, and her dad was doing her homeschool lessons. I said, oh, what's your favorite subject? Latin and algebra. And I just went, okay.
Okay.
God, I stand corrected. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So, yeah, I think, just realizing that, it's what I was going to tell you about the Pregnancy Resource Center, is I'm like a little hesitant to get in there. I'm like, I'm going to have to learn how to be, blah, blah, blah. And what I found is no pressure, actually laying out every single option they had, spending an hour with them. Tell me about you. What needs do you have? What do you really think about this? What are your hopes? I'm really getting to know them, offering them hope and help. And then no matter what, we want you to know we are here for you. Come back. Even if you get the abortion, come back. Let us help you. And I was like, that is not what I expected. That is not what the world hears. But then you hear about Planned Parenthood from people like Abby Johnson, and you've got women crammed in small spaces, unrespectful, and just assuming, I know it's hard, we know you have to have an abortion. That's it, The real choice is at the pregnancy centers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just read an advanced copy of a book that our friends at Save the Storks wrote called Unplanned Grace. And but the authors are, they're not sisters, but they both have the last name Smith, Natasha Smith and Brittany Smith. And they track all these stories because one of the, like you just kind of alluded to, one of the complaints that people bring up against the pro-life movement is, well, you just care about the baby till it's born, or, you don't care about the mother. You don't care about the situation afterwards. And it's just not true. And like you've seen, and they track all the different kind of spheres that are affected by the pro-life movement: the mother, the father, the post-abortive, the baby. They go through all of those different categories, and then they tell these fantastic stories about how the pro-life movement, one facet or another, has really stepped in and spoken to those wounded people, and because we're wounded people too, right?
Yeah, and that's such a good point, Sarah, about the woundedness that we all carry in one way or another. But before we transition to some of our last questions, Catherine, can we just spend a minute talking about what you've mentioned, the women in your office that are post-abortive, that now are reflecting on their choices? Because we know for certainty, like you said, basically everyone knows someone or has been affected by abortion in their life in some way. And so you've had experience with working with women who have now dealing with the pain of that. And you, again, with your unique perspective of also looking back and having so much regret about what you used to believe and just being a part of abortion in the way that you were. So can you just offer to the women or men listening that have been touched personally by abortion, how we can go from wounded to healing in that?
Yes, thank you. It's so important. We don't talk a lot about healing from abortion. It's people push it away. Women are told they should be proud of it. We hear from the world that it's just something that has to happen. And a lot of us ate that lie. And a lot of people are deeply wounded, but it's so repressed and suppressed that most people really don't know what's behind a lot of things that are coming out of the fact they had abortion, whether it's relationship problems loving their children. There's so many things that come out of it they're so unaware of. And one of the benefits for me of being at Path of Life in Spokane is Sherry picked up on my past and encouraged me to do a group for abortion recovery. And it's actually designed for women who've had abortions, and understanding that I probably should not be in a group of women who've had abortions getting my healing, because I was the instrument, and so she had me work one-on-one with a woman who'd also had an abortion in early life, and I believe was in her 70s at the time, and we just did a one-on-one, which was incredible, starting with having to face up to what you've done, but it actually started before that with the love of God. And as I look at my past, how God stepped in with his love and healing first before he started exposing what I'd done in steps that I could handle without crushing me. Such grace and mercy where he could have just taken me out right in the middle of one of those, and that's the grace and love of God that I mattered to him also. So in this class that we did together, it was about facing that, knowing who God is, knowing his grace and mercy, and learning to forgive others who may have encouraged us, the doctor who did it, the Planned Parenthood, wherever people went. people from their family and friends who encouraged them on that path, and then getting to the point of being able to forgive yourself for what you've done. And it was incredible. We did, I don't know how many abortions I did. I know it's a small number relatively. One is too many. But we did a memorial for those babies, and it was beautiful. We acknowledged who they were. For women who have had abortions themselves, there's a strong encouragement to name them and to even write a letter to them. And it's just so incredibly healing to know that that is our God who's willing to be patient with us to get us to the point where he can save our lives. It's an incredibly beautiful thing. So I would strongly encourage anybody, including the men. People like Lecrae speaks out about the women or at least one woman he encouraged to have an abortion. And now as a Christian rapper, when he realized what he'd done, he now speaks out to the men for healing, which is a beautiful thing. So I'd strongly encourage people to get hold of their local pregnancy resource center, because almost all of them have classes for people who've had abortions for healing. And I would say there's forgiveness, there's complete and total forgiveness. God casts it behind his back, and you get healing and you move ahead. And he may use that experience in your story to help other people who've also been wounded.
I didn't think about what you're saying, that it really is a journey, isn't it, of processing all of it and thinking of forgiving yourself, forgiving people who encouraged you or were a part of it in some way. It really is a big undertaking in that way, but one, I think you're right that, we all have woundedness that we need to work through, and but this is a big one that women and men shouldn't neglect and should reach out for help, because it's so important, and it's so evident, Catherine, in your life and just your honesty and humbleness that you've been able to work through this so you can talk about it. And then just you talking about it, I know, is, that brings healing and encouragement to other people, and which is so important, especially as the body of Christ, to really walk this with other people is being able to talk about it and share. And sometimes we need help in doing that. So that's really, really good advice.
And do you have any books or places? You gave the resource of look for your local pregnancy center, because they do have classes and they have counseling and things like that, which is a huge resource. Do you have any other resources you would recommend or books to read?
The resource I used was called Forgiven and Free, and it has a lot of resources also listed in it. So that would be, I think, a first start. I know that the different pregnancy centers use different things. There are a lot of resources out there. There's one I want to call Rachel's Vineyard, maybe. Starts with Rachel. But they actually do retreats where women can come, and men. I think they do them for couples and men too, I believe. I should have checked that in advance. But I think your best resource, because you'll want to be in a group. I don't think going through it by yourself is a good idea. I think you've got to have people around you who have been through the experience, are healed. You need a guide. You need somebody who cares about you to listen with you. And one other resource is a photo. It's a photo essay, essentially, where women and some men, a photographer who's a Christian woman, has people who've either had abortions, or the men who've had their partners or wives have abortions. And she does a photo it's called After the Abortion. And there's a photo of what they felt like and what they experienced after the abortion. And then there's one after their redemption. It's so beautiful because you see they're feeling in an artistic way of what that felt like for them, whether they were tied up or in a cocoon or curled up in fetal position, but so beautiful for them to tell their story and have a small quote underneath of it. And then after they had met Jesus and really felt healed from it, there's such a beautiful redemption photo with it too that I think it's worth looking at. It's hard to look at people's feelings, but I think there's something so expressive in that when women are told to push down their abortions, that they don't matter, that it was nothing, to be able to express, because women know, women know. And to be able to express that authentically, I think is just beautiful. And then to see the peace of Jesus healing.
Yeah, what a beautiful way to express a gift in art and photography and all of that to bring about healing. That's really beautiful.
So we want to move into our closing questions, and you've kind of alluded to some answers to some of them, but like, what advice would you give young girls today?
Yeah, I think my biggest advice is to know your path you're on. Honestly, the worldly path isn't worth it. It blows up. And I just really encourage women to look at Jesus and to never, Proverbs 4, turn away from it. Don't step on it. Turn away, keep going, pass on. Like, don't even taste it. That Jesus is worth it. Jesus is true love in the world. And the only way, I can tell you, he's the only way. And so that would be my encouragement to women. I heard Josh McDowell say that his dad said to him, only step away from Christianity if you are absolutely certain it's a lie. And, it's true. We step away because we have boyfriends, It's not a lie. So that would be my big advice, is chase after Jesus.
That's good advice. Okay, Catherine, I can tell just from listening to you this past hour that you are a reader, because you keep mentioning things that people say or wrote. So we love to ask what books our guests are reading right now, or maybe you're a one book at a time person, but what book are you reading right now?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm so glad to listen to your show and hear these women who have a whole bunch of books open, because I tend to do that. To be honest, God has really put on my heart to just go through the Gospels and be one of his disciples, just being on the ground with Jesus back then, but doing it now. So that's my big project right now. So I don't have any big books I'm really doing, but along with that, I've gone back to one of my first discipleship books by Dallas Willard, because it goes along with that, and it's The Divine Conspiracy. So it really goes along with the Gospels and what really Jesus was talking about in Matthew 5-7. So that's what I'm doing right now. And Lisa Turkhurst, this is a book I read all the time to my grandkids, which it is such a delight. It's called, I think it's called It'll Be Okay. It is. It's called It'll Be Okay. And it's a children's book, but it's about how God has a beautiful plan for each one of us, and how he pushes us into a dark and dirty space, that little tiny seed, and how we become this big, beautiful tree. But just this caring of God, and that even though it's dark and messy, God's doing something to build a beautiful tree out of you. So.
Okay, last question. If you could have coffee with any woman from history, who would it be?
So two things came up for me. I have never heard my mother's faith story, and she's with Jesus now. So I can't wait to get with her at some point and actually hear her faith story, because it's got to be incredible. But the one woman I really want to meet from history, other than my mom, is I'd like to meet Mary. Just the idea from the guy who wrote the book on Body Tells Our Stories, which I haven't read the book, but I heard him talk with you guys, where Mary was the first Christian. And the privilege of seeing Jesus grow up, what was that really like? What did he do? All the stuff that she treasured in her heart. Man, I would love to hear what he was like as a child, and what that was like for her to be following him on his ministry, and her experience at the cross, thinking it's over, even though she knew that her heart was going to get wounded, and to find out he's alive. Wow, that's got to be the biggest story ever told.
Well, Catherine, thank you so much for being on our podcast. And I just applaud your courage and your humility to share your story with us. And I know this is not the end of your story. And we pray that God will give you opportunities to share your stories with women all over the place. And just that I know it'll it will be an encouragement and a blessing, like it has been to me personally today, just to hear your story. And so thank you so much for sharing with us.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity, and God does amazing work. Thank you.